Short is the story, long is the life.
Wukong's archive presents China Urban Legends, The Lamplights, The Boat Arrives.
In the spring of 2004, I was transferred to Wenzhou for work. My unit was in Luqing district. The dormitory hadn't been assigned yet, so I rented an old house on Shuomen Street. Shuomen Street sits along the Zhou River. Step out of the alley and you're at the river, and across the river is Jiangxin Islet. The landlord's surname was Zhou, named Zhou Desui, 76 years old that year. 5 generations of his ancestors had lived on this street. He said this house was built in his great-grandfather's time. The beams dated from the Guangxu reign, the tiles had been replaced during the Republic era, and the stone slabs propping up the base of the walls were old materials from a Song dynasty dock. Every single one worn slick and shiny from the rubbing of the boatmen.
I asked him, Shuomen, that's an odd name. What does it mean?
He said, Shuo means north. Shuomen was the north gate of Old Wenzhou City, also called Jinhai Gate, the Sea-calming Gate. Right outside the gate was Shuomen Port. In the Song and Yuan dynasties, ships from all over the world docked here. Wenzhou was bustling back then. There's a line of poetry, a stretch of splendor upon the sea's edge. From of old it was called Little Hangzhou. He pointed toward Jiangxin Islet. See those 2 pagodas? East Pagoda, West Pagoda. In old times, when a ship entered the Zhou River, it first recognized the pagodas, then the port. When the pagoda lights came on, the ship knew it was home.
I followed his finger and looked. The Zhou River is very wide. In the middle of the river, a lone islet, 2 pagodas standing on it, one east, one west, separated by hundreds of years of wind.
Back then I didn't know that for the next 2 years, in the dead of night, I would always hear ships entering the harbor on the river, and the docks of Shuomen Port by then had already been abandoned for decades. The people of Wenzhou call their city White Deer City, and also Dipper City. Old Zhou told me the origin. In the first year of the Tianxiang era of the Eastern Jin dynasty, the court wanted to establish a commandery along the Zhou River, and invited Guopu to inspect the land. Guopu climbed West Gua Mountain, saw the Zhou River coming from the west and bending around the foot of the city, and said this place, leaning against the river, backed by mountains and connected to the tide, was a good place to build a city. Following the positions of the Big Dipper's 7 stars, he selected 7 mountains as the city's framework: Huagai, Songtai, Jigu, Guogong, Haitan, Xuanshan, plus Huangtu Mountain. The city walls were built along the mountains, and the water streets and alleys inside the city all followed the river, rising and falling, winding and bending. Seen from above, the entire city was a Big Dipper ladle, hence the name Dipper City. That West Gua Mountain was later called Guogong Mountain. Wenzhou people have been chanting that name for over 1,000 years, and what they chant is Guopu. Legend has it that during the days of building the city walls, a white deer suddenly appeared, carrying a flower in its mouth, running in from outside the city. It ran a full circle around the city, then ran into the Zhou River and vanished. The people of Wenzhou took this as an auspicious omen, and from then on called the city White Deer City. They took the flower the white deer had carried by the river and planted it at the entrance of Wuma Street. Old Zhou said that flower bloomed every year afterward, more vigorously than anywhere else, until the road was built in the Republican era and it was gone. Old Zhou said that when he was a child, his grandfather pointed out to him a shallow mark on a stone on the old foundation of the city wall, round, like a hoof print. Grandfather said it was left on the night the white deer circled the city. The deer came in from the north of the city, and its first step landed on this stone. Later the city wall was demolished, and that stone was carried off to pad the river levee. Still later the levee was rebuilt too, and the stone had gone who knows where. When old Zhou's great-grandmother was still alive, she told another story. She said that when she was young, one year a thick fog rose over the Zhou River, and someone in the fog called her to go look at the river. She walked to the riverbank and saw a white deer in the mist, standing at the water's edge, lowering its head to drink. It drank for a while, raised its head to glance toward her, then turned and walked into the fog and was gone. Great-grandmother said the deer's antlers were white, its whole body white, like moonlight falling on water. She lived to over 90 and only saw it that once. The year great-grandmother passed, she left a message for my father. If the white deer is still here, Wenzhou is still here. If the white deer leaves, Wenzhou will be empty. My father asked her where the white deer was. Great-grandmother said, in the water and also on the shore, moving along with the tide. Old Zhou said he remembered those words of his great-grandmother his whole life, didn't figure them out, and didn't dare forget. He also said old Wenzhou had 7 city gates: Zhenhai Gate, Ying'an Gate, Laifu Gate, Yongning Gate, Ruian Gate, Wangjiang Gate, and Yongqing Gate. City gates were for people to pass through, water gates for boats. At the entrance of Shuomen Street there used to be a water gate. Boats would enter from the Zhou River, pass through the water gate into the city, and row all the way to the entrance of Wuma Street. Later the water gate was filled in, and boats couldn't come in anymore. He sighed and said, with boats unable to come in, more people went out and fewer came back. Old Zhou told me all this on the day I moved in, as we sat at the back door drinking tea. He said, the white deer carried a flower, and the flower fell at Wuma. This place Wenzhou relies on the river for its living, and also loses its people to the river. Since you'll be living by the river, if you hear anything at night, don't make a fuss. At the time I took it as just an old man's idle talk and didn't take it to heart. Until that August, the 2nd month after I moved into Shuomen Street, I heard boat sounds on the river for the first time. Jiangxin Isle is a solitary island in the middle of the Jiang River. When the tide rises, water surrounds it on all sides. When the tide falls, the only way onto it is still by boat. When Xiaolingyun served as governor of Yongjia, he wrote, cutting across the turbulent current toward the sheer cliff, the lonely isle charms amid the river's flow. Clouds and sun reflect upon each other. Sky and water share one lucent glow. Old Zhou said that in Xiaolingyun's day, there were no pagodas on the isle, just a sandbar in mid-river, covered in reeds. In years of high tides, only a patch of dry ground in the center remained above water. Later, someone built a temple on the isle that became Jiangxin Temple. During the Southern Song, Zhou fled south across the river and stayed at Jiangxin Temple, where he inscribed the words Qing Hui, clear radiance. The temple's couplet was also written by a Song dynasty man, from the brush of Wang Shipong, and it was about the tides. Clouds appearing at dawn, appearing, 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 then appearing to scatter. Tides, rising with the time, rising, 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 then rising to fall away. Old Zhou said that as a boy he could recite that couplet from memory, and he still could now say it fast enough and it sounds like chanting scripture. In the Tang dynasty, the East Pagoda was built. In the Song dynasty, the West Pagoda. The twin towers became the navigation markers for the Jiang River. Boats coming in from the sea would first spot the 2 pagodas, one east, one west, and know which way to turn the rudder. Old Zhou said that his grandfather, Zhou, had kept the pagoda lamps on Jiangxin Isle when he was young. The keeper was in charge of 2 lamps, lit at dusk, extinguished at dawn. They burned rapeseed oil, and 3 refills were needed each night. If you skimped on the oil, the wick would char and the boats wouldn't be able to see. He fueled those lamps for decades, until the smell of lamp oil soaked into his hands and wouldn't wash away. Zhou once said that the 2 lamps in the pagoda had bases cast in bronze when the towers were first built, and the shades were glass added later. Everything else could be replaced, but not the lamp bases. Change them, and the lamps would no longer recognize the pagoda. One year, the Jiang flooded, waves crashed over the island, and the West Pagoda's lamp base was swept into the river. Zhou spent 3 days diving and finally retrieved it from the riverbed. He said the base lay at the bottom of the river, ringed by a school of fish, their bellies glowing bright, as though lit by the lamp, as though they'd been fed by its light for 100 years.
Old Zhou said his grandfather once told him that what the keeper feared most wasn't wind or waves, it was fog. When fog rose over the Jiangxin and boats couldn't see the pagodas, they navigated by the tower bells. The West Pagoda's eaves hung a string of iron bells that rang whenever the wind blew. Boatmen heard the bells through the mist and followed the sound. Wherever the bells rang, there lay the shore. His grandfather kept the lamps for 14 years and said the tower bells followed a rule: strong wind, rapid ringing; light wind, slow ringing. But there was one exception: they never rang at midnight, during the Zisher hour. Once Zisher passed, the bells went mute, as though someone had seized them in a fist, not a single sound. They only rang again close to dawn. I asked old Zhou, why was that? Old Zhou didn't answer. He only said, grandfather said the Zisher hour is the time for changing shifts.
I asked, changing what shifts? Old Zhou still didn't answer. He finished his tea, got up, and went to feed the cat. For several years after that, I never figured out what he meant. The keeper's lamp burned from night to dawn. Where would a shift change come in? Old Zhou said that his grandfather eventually left Jiangxin Islet, and it was all because of one thing. One year, in late autumn, a thick fog rose over the Jiang and didn't lift for 7 days straight. On the 7th night, at the Zisher hour, the tower bells rang. His grandfather was up in the pagoda and heard them. His heart lurched. The bells never rang at Zisher. He leaned out and looked down. In the fog, a row of lanterns, one after another, moved along the river toward the sea mouth, advancing in perfect formation, like a fleet of boats. He counted them, 7. The next day the fog cleared. He came down from the pagoda, rolled up his bedding, and walked back to Shuomen Street. He never set foot on the island again. When asked why, he said those 7 lanterns had come to fetch someone. He heard someone on the boats calling his name. He didn't answer. No answer meant he wasn't taken, and the boats left. He was afraid that next time, the voice on the boat wouldn't be calling his name. It would be calling someone else's.
On the 2nd month after I moved to Shuomen Street, on the 17th of August, the river was running a big tide that day, and the water climbed over the stone steps of the old dock. In the small hours, I was suddenly woken up. It was the sound of water, great, loud water, mixed with the creak of oars, one after another, as if a boat were coming across the river. My place was less than 100 meters from the river, and I was used to the sound of the river's tide, but this wasn't the tide. The tide was continuous and muffled, like someone turning over a huge quilt at the edge of the sky. This was the squeak of oars, mixed with the splash of a hull cutting through water, and the shouts of men, far away, but very clear, one after another: weigh anchor, drop anchor, like the work chants of an old-time dock.
I got up and pushed open the back window. A thin mist had risen over the river, and the tower light on Jiangxin Islet flickered faintly. There was nothing on the river. No boats. But the sounds were still there: oars, water, work chants. Slowly drawing closer to the Shuomen side, until they reached about where the old dock was and stopped. Then I heard the sound of an iron chain, clank, clank, like someone lowering an anchor chain into the water. After that, everything fell silent. I stood at the window for a long time. The river mist thinned and gathered again. The tower light glowed and dimmed. The next morning I asked old Zhou. Old Zhou was feeding the cat in the yard and didn't even look up. "You heard it?" I said I had. He said, "If you heard it, you heard it. Don't go out to look." I asked why. He set down the cat food, straightened up, and gave me a look. "Shuomen Harbor has been dead for decades. A boat that docks in the middle of the night is not for you to see."
I asked again, then what was the boat for? Old Zhou didn't answer. He bent down and pushed the food bowl a little closer to the cat. The cat wouldn't eat. It crouched beside the bowl, ears pricked, facing the direction of the river, completely still.
During the day I went out of my way to visit the old dock. The stone steps were covered in moss, but in one spot, The moss looked like something had scraped against it, leaving a fresh mark that ran from the waterline all the way up to the top of the steps, like a boat had come alongside and its hull had rubbed against them. I crouched down and looked for a long time. At the edge of the mark there was a clump of wet mud, and in the mud were a few blades of grass, not the kind that grew by the river, but the kind from the sea. I recognized them. You only saw them at the river mouth when the tide went out. In the 12th lunar month, the sound came even closer. I lay on the windowsill listening, and after the sound stopped, someone came off the boat. Their footsteps were wet as slap, slap, walking all the way from the dock to the mouth of the alley, where they stopped. Then a voice, neither loud nor low, called out, "Zhou family." It was calling old Zhou's surname. I hardly dared to breathe. The voice called once more, and then there was nothing.
Later I heard it 2 more times, once in the 10th month and once in the 12th lunar month, both on days of big tides. The second time I asked Old Chun at the end of the street. Old Chun said he'd heard it too, from childhood to now. He said his father had told him that wasn't a boat. It was the voice of Shuomen Harbor itself. The harbor had been abandoned, the boats were gone. But the harbor still remembered it had boats, and on the days of the big tides it would sound off on its own.
Before Zhou Offa kept the lighthouse, he was a salvager on the Jiang River. The people of Wenzhou called this line of work water fumbling, fishing up things that had sunk in the river, and fishing up people too. Old Zhou said his grandfather had worked that trade for the better part of his life and had set down one rule: hauling up objects was fine, but when you haul up a person, get them to shore quickly. Don't talk to the corpse, and don't look at the corpse's face. He said the people who drowned in the Jiang River, some of them weren't willing to go. If you looked at their face, they'd remember you, and they'd come find you in the night. In the 19th year of the Republic, the Jiang flooded, and a cargo boat capsized downstream from Islet in the river. It sank a whole hold of tung oil and bolts of cloth. The boat owner hired Zhou Offa to salvage it. He dove down, felt his way to the stern, and tried to get in through the cargo hold. When he pushed the door open, the hold was full of water, and sitting in the water was a person. He got a start, then looked closer. It wasn't a person, it was a coffin, standing upright in the hold, soaked black with water. 7 iron nails were driven into the head of the coffin, driven in clean and even.
Zhou Offa surfaced and told the boat owner, "I'm not salvaging this boat, and I don't want your money either. Find someone else." The boat owner asked him what was wrong. He said, "That upright coffin on your boat, it's there to stand guard. The one in that coffin kept watch over a door his whole life, and even in death he's nailed to the boat. A boat like that, I don't dare touch."
That boat was eventually hauled up by someone else. They say there really was an upright coffin in the cargo hold. There were no bones in it, only a straw rain cape and a pair of straw sandals, laid out neatly, as if they'd been set aside for someone to wear. The boat owner's grandfather, back when he was young, had run trade to the South Seas and his ship had sunk once. Everyone aboard died, only he survived, drifting back clinging to a piece of the hull. After he returned, he set down a rule: every boat his family sent to sea had to have an empty coffin standing in the cargo hold. He said it was to install a substitute in advance, to stake a claim on death, so the king of hell wouldn't come collect the real person. What was placed in the coffin was that straw rain cape the old gentleman had been wearing the day he fell into the water.
Old Zhou said that when that rain cape was brought up, they hung it out on the dock to dry for 3 days. No matter how they dried it, it stayed wet. Touch it and it felt like it had just come out of the water. The boat owner's family later took the cape into the ancestral hall and enshrined it, saying it was the old gentleman's keepsake. It had been enshrined less than a year when the hall caught fire in the middle of the night. Everything burned except that rain cape. It hung from the beam, untouched by the flames, and still wet.
After old Zhou finished telling this story, he said, "When people from Wenzhou go to sea, they all believe this. Once a boat sets out, your life is handed to the sea. If you come back, it means the coffin took the blow for you. If you don't come back, that's just what your fate had in store. Why won't that rain cape dry? Because it's staying wet for someone. As long as there's someone who hasn't come back yet, it can't dry.
Old Zhou said his grandfather quit water fumbling for good in the 26th year of the Republic, in the autumn of that year. Someone hired him to haul up a bell that had sunk outside the mouth of the Jiangxin. When the bell came up, it was covered in barnacles. He knocked on it, it gave a dull thud, no ring to it at all. Zhou Offa turned the bell over, and stuffed inside the bell's body was a wad of something. He pulled it out, it was a straw rain cape, wet, exactly like the one he'd seen in that upright coffin years before. He didn't dare say anything at the time. He handed the bell over to the man who'd hired him, took his money, and went home. After he got home, he threw his entire water fumbling kit, his ropes, his iron hooks, his oilcloth clothes, into the Jiangxin. His mother asked him what was wrong. He said, "Pull one thing out of the river, pull out another, no matter what I pull up, it's the same thing. It's following me now. It knows my face." From that day on, Zhou Offa changed trades and kept the lighthouse. A lighthouse keeper doesn't have to go underwater. Things are on dry land, where you can see them. I asked, "That rain cape in the coffin, who was it left for?" Old Zhou said, "For the next one to fall in the water. Whoever puts on that rain cape becomes the substitute. The substitute pays back a life, and the real person comes home."
On Jiangxin Islet there is a shrine to Tianxiang. In the second year of Dayou in the southern Song dynasty, Yuan troops breached Linen. When Tianxiang escaped from the Yuan camp and fled south, all the way to Wenzhou, where he stayed on Jiangxin Islet for nearly a month. There he wrote, returning north, taking lodging at Zhongchuan Temple, and later set sail from here for Fuzhou to support the enthronement of Emperor Duanzong. The room where he stayed at Jiangxin Temple was later converted into a shrine by later generations. Inside, his statue is enshrined, and stone steels are embedded in the walls on both sides, inscribed with his poem. Wind and frost over 10,000 li, my temple's already threaded with white. Drifting and rootless, I look back and my heroic heart grieves. Beneath Luofu Mountain has the snow come yet? Over the heart of the Yangtze, upon whom does the moon shine? I went to the island to see it once. The shrine is not large. The main hall holds a seated statue of Tianxiang. The caretaker is an old woman surnamed Zhang, whom the people of Wenzhou call Zhang Apopo. She said her family has tended this shrine for 3 generations. Her mother watched it, and her mother's grandmother watched it before that. I asked her whether anyone had come to the shrine at night. She looked at me and said, "You heard about this from old Zhou, didn't you?" I said, "No, I was just asking." She said, "Premier One is no ordinary man. He comes out and walks around at night. We caretakers have a rule. Lock the gate at dark, and once it's locked, no one opens it. If you hear footsteps in the hall, that's Premier One walking. Don't light a lamp. Don't make a sound. Just let him walk." I asked her if she believed it. She said, "I was 17 when I took over from my mother as caretaker. The first night, I heard someone walking in the main hall. 3 circles, then it stopped. I hid behind the door, not daring to breathe. It's been like that every year since. He walks even in the height of summer, even in the depths of winter. Never more than that, just 3 circles." She said, "My mother told me that Premier One is counting people. Counting how many people in Wenzhou City still remember him. When he's done counting, he goes back and sits." Zhang Apopo also said that back in 1966, some people wanted to smash the shrine. The night before, the main hall was walked in all night long, the footsteps heavier than usual, never stopping until dawn. The people who came the next day reached the gate and saw an old rusty sword hanging from the lintel. They turned around and went back, and never came again. Who hung that sword there, no one knew, and later it disappeared. I asked Zhang Apopo whether those 3 circles of footsteps happened every day or only on chosen days. she said, chosen days. The 1st and 15th of the lunar month, Qingming and the winter solstice, and the anniversary of Premier Wen's death. Normally he doesn't walk. But if you open the gate at an hour when it shouldn't be opened, he'll come out to take a look and see who it is. I said, so he still counts people then? Zheng Apopo said, he counts. My mother said that in the old days he counted people. Later he counted lights. Whichever household's lamp was still lit meant someone still remembered. The more lamps, the steadier he walked. I said, are there still many lamps now? Zheng Apopo didn't answer right away. After a long pause she said, many. There's a ring of lights along the riverbank, all lamps waiting for people out at sea. Some have been lit for over 10 years, some for decades. As long as the lamps don't go out, he keeps counting. I left the shrine and stood at the gate for a while. The river wind blew over, and the iron bell on the west pagoda rang a few times. Zheng Apopo called out from behind me. The bell rang. Did you hear it? That's the pagoda telling you the wind has risen, and the boats are about to enter harbor. Tonight if a boat docks and someone comes ashore, don't talk to them. If you talk, he'll take you for someone who's come to meet him, and he'll follow you home. Wuma Street sits at the center of Luqing, and in the old days it was the liveliest street in all of Wenzhou. As for where the name came from, the story goes that back in the Eastern Jin dynasty, Wang Shiji served as governor of Yongjia and rode out in a carriage pulled by 5 horses. The people erected a 5-horse archway at the intersection where he often passed, and so the street got its name Wuma Street, the Street of 5 Horses. Wang Shiji also left behind an ink pool in Wenzhou. Every day he rinsed his brushes at the edge of the pool until the water turned the color of ink. Old Zhou said that before liberation, a stone archway still stood at the head of Wuma Street, carved with 5 horses. Later, during the campaign to destroy the 4 olds, the archway was smashed, and the stones were carted off to pave the road. People in Wenzhou still talk about it and say what a shame it was. Old Zhou said that Wenzhou, this place, had produced scholars and merchants alike since ancient times. During the Southern Song there was the Yongjia school of thought, Yishur and the others emphasized practical achievement. They said the purpose of study was to get things done, and doing business was also getting things done. Farming and commerce should go hand in hand. By the 1980s, Wuma Street had come alive again. Both sides of the street were lined with people hawking goods from stalls and opening up shops. Folks in Wenzhou called it practicing the stall. Old Zhou said that in 1980, a young woman selling buttons at the head of Wuma Street got the very first individual business license in the whole country, and the newspapers all ran the story. After that, Wenzhou people made a name for themselves in business, and the whole country knew that Wenzhou folks dared to charge ahead. In the autumn of 2004, Wuma Street underwent renovation. The road surface was torn up and relayed. Workers dug up a stretch of old flagstone road right in the middle of the street. The stones were worn smooth and shiny, carved with marks both deep and shallow, some round, some square. Onlookers said they were cart ruts, but one old master worker squatted down and examined them for a long while, then said they weren't cart ruts at all. They were hoof prints. A line of 5 horses' hoof prints, running from the east end of the street all the way to the west end, and right at the street's head, the prints broke off. That night, Wuma Street was sealed off. The construction crew pulled out, and 2 watchmen were left sleeping in the site shed. The next morning, the 2 workers said that in the middle of the night they heard the sound of horses' hooves on the street. Clip-clop, coming from far to near, walking from the east end to the west end, and stopping at the street's head. They pressed their eyes to the cracks in the shed and looked out. The street was completely empty. Not a soul, just a street lamp swaying in the wind. But when they measured the flagstones again the next day, the hoof prints were deeper than the day before, as if more horses had walked over them. I asked Old Zhou about it later. Old Zhou said the old-timers of Wuma Street had a saying. Governor Wang's carriage comes out to patrol the city every night. What you hear on the street during the day is car horns. What you hear at night, that's the voice of old Wenzhou itself. I asked how the hoof prints could be underneath the flagstones. Old Zhou said, The flagstones were laid later. The hoof prints are on the old road surface underneath. Governor Wang's carriage travels the old road. The new road on top, he looks down on it. Later, when Wuma Street was finished and reopened for business, it was lively, all right, but I always felt something was missing. Old Zhou said what was missing was the sound of hooves. The new road was too thick. The hoofbeats couldn't come through anymore. He said the voice of old Wenzhou is pressed layer upon layer under the ground. You dig open one layer, and you hear one layer. Dig all the way down, and what you hear is the sound of hooves from the day the white deer entered the city. In 1969, the whole country was digging air raid shelters, and Shuomen Street was no exception. Old Zhou was in his early 20s back then, digging with the street's militia company. They dug down under the old pier at Shuomen Harbor and came across a stretch of blue brick vaulted arch. Under the arch was a big hole, pitch black, with wind blowing in through it, and the wind carried a watery, fishy smell. The militia company commander sent a man in to look. The man went in with a flashlight and walked less than 20 steps before he backed out, saying there was a large pool of water inside, filled to the brim, no bottom in sight. When the flashlight beam swept across the surface, things were floating out there, like boat planks or maybe wood, and there was a smell you couldn't quite place, like tide water, and at the same time like temple incense.
The company commander didn't dare make the call himself, so he reported it up. The reply came down in 4 characters, seal it on the spot. The militia worked through the night, relaying the bricks of the arch, plastering the seams with lime, and piling half a man's height of dirt on top. Old Zhou said that on the day they sealed it, he looked through a crack in the seam, pitch dark in there, couldn't see a thing. But he heard the water. Splash, splash. Very faint, like something down in the water turning over. He was young then, didn't think much of it, went home and fell straight asleep. In the decades since, he's had the same dream every year. He's standing at the edge of that pool, things floating on the surface, and the moment he bends down to look, he wakes up.
In the winter of 2004, Shuomen Street was being demolished and rebuilt, and the construction crew dug down and hit that same arch again. This time no one dared seal it, so they reported it to the Cultural Relics Department. An archaeological team came out and said it was the site of an ancient harbor from the Song and Yuan dynasties. Under the arch was a waterway for mooring boats, silted up for several hundred years. From the mud, they pulled out a good number of Song dynasty porcelain shards, copper coins, and half a wooden rudder. The wood had rotted down to just a frame, but you could still make out the color of the paint on it. I went out to the site to see it once myself. On the brick walls of the waterway were marks, deep and shallow, worn there by boat hulls scraping past. Hundreds of years, boats coming and going, all rubbing against the same spot. Old Zhang from the archaeological team chatted with me and said something offhand. This waterway connects to the O River, and the O River connects to the sea. As for what's on the other side of the sea, hard to say. I asked him what he meant by the other side of the sea. He waved his hand. Archaeologists only deal with what's underground. What's underground and what's in the water are not the same thing. Take my advice. Don't come here alone at night. I asked him why. He said, the night watchman told me. At night there are voices talking in this waterway. Through the wall, a low buzz, like chanting sutras, and like men calling out work chants. Old Zhang also said that during the dredging, the workers dug up a slab of stone standing upright in the silt at the bottom of the waterway, half a man's height, planted in the mud like someone had stuck it there. The stone had been soaked black by the water. 3 characters were carved on it, incised into the surface, the grooves packed with mud. The workers rinsed it with water and made them out. Zhan Shui Jie, the water-suppressing boundary. Old Zhang said that boundary markers like this are normally set up on the shore. Outside the marker is water, inside is land. But this one stood in the middle of the waterway. On this side of the boundary was Shuomen, on the other side the sea. He said in 20 years of doing archaeology, it was the first time he'd ever seen a boundary marker placed in water. Later the slab was hauled away and put into storage. When old Zhou heard me tell him about it, he was silent for a long while, then said, "A boundary marker set in the water. It was meant to keep the things in the water from crossing the line onto shore. Now that the marker's gone, the boundary is gone."
Wenzhou merchants are famous for daring to go to sea. Old Zhou said that back in the 80s, on Shuomen Street, every household had its men out running around. Some went to Guangzhou, some to Shanghai, the bolder ones went to Nanyang, or to Europe. Once they went out, some came back, and some never did. In the old houses on Shuomen Street, 8 families out of 10 enshrined photographs of the men who had gone to sea, and in front of the photographs a little oil lamp burned all year round. When the oil dried up, it was refilled all the way through the year.
Old Zhou had a neighbor named Tianxiang, 20 years younger than him, who lived at the end of the street. In 1992, Tianxiang partnered with someone for an ocean-going voyage. The boat left Wenzhou and headed south. Before he set out, he invited old Zhou over for a drink and said, "Uncle Zhou, this time I'm going far out to sea. When I come back, I'll rent a shop for a chui on Wuma Street. If I can't rent one, I'll set up a stall at the entrance of Shuomen Street and sell the paper boats she folds." Old Zhou said that on the day Aiming left, a chui walked him to the dock. Aiming got on the boat, turned back, and shouted, "I taught you how to fold paper boats. Even when I'm not around, you fold them every year."
The boat sank halfway. Of the 7 people on board, 5 were pulled back up. Tianxiang and another boatman were never found. People said that outside the mouth of the Zhou River, the wind was strong and the waves fierce. Once a man fell in, he was gone in the blink of an eye. Old Zhou said that the day the news came back, a chui didn't cry. She sat at the doorstep all night. The next day she opened up as usual and went on with life as usual, only that every year on the Ghost Festival, she burned an extra stack of paper. Tianxiang's wife, a chui, stayed on Shuomen Street for more than 10 years and never remarried. Every Ghost Festival, she burned paper by the river and also set a paper boat afloat. The paper boat was taught to her by Tianxiang before he went to sea. It was folded from tin foil, and a grain of rice was placed in the boat's belly, said to be rations for the people on the boat. The paper boat was set on the river and drifted with the tide. Once it floated far away, the lamp on it could no longer be seen. Old Zhou said that in the first few years, a chui's paper boats would always capsize 7 or 8 meters out. When one capsized, she'd fold another, and she kept folding until one didn't capsize.
On the Ghost Festival in 2004, I also went to the riverside to watch. The banks of the Zhou River were all people burning paper. Firelight flickered, and paper ash drifted with the wind toward the river. I saw a chui squatting on the stone steps of the dock, putting a paper boat into the water. The boat drifted 7 or 8 meters out, then suddenly stopped and spun around on the river's surface. A chui stood up and stared straight at that boat. Then I saw it, from the direction of Jiangxin Islet. There was a lamp, very bright, moving slowly this way. As it came closer, I could make it out. It was a paper boat, much bigger than the ones a chui folded, with a little lamp lit on it, the wick jumping and twitching. It didn't come to shore. It just circled in the middle of the river. After 2 circles, it tilted suddenly and sank.
A chui looked away, squatted back down, and continued burning her paper. I heard her mutter something, very soft, as if talking to herself. One came back. The next day I passed the end of the street and saw a chui airing paper boats at her doorway. Folded from tin foil, a whole pile of them, big and small. When she saw me, she didn't hide it. She said, "I folded too many. I'll store them, and set them out one by one on the Ghost Festival." I asked, "That big one last night, was that yours?" She shook her head. "I only set the small ones. That big one, I didn't set it, and none of the neighbors did either." I asked her who said it, then. A Chui put down the paper boat in her hand and said, "Who said it? I don't know. But I know it came to pick someone up." I said, "Pick up who?" She didn't answer, lowered her head, and went on folding. After a while she said, "Who it picks up, that depends on where it sinks. If it sinks in the middle of the river, it's picking up someone from a long way off. The one from a long way off, that's only aiming." That night when I got back, I asked old Zhou what a Chui meant by one came back. Old Zhou smoked his cigarette and didn't say anything for a long time. Only after he finished the cigarette did he speak.
He said, "There's a saying on the O River. When someone is lost at sea, for his soul to come back, a boat has to go fetch him. A paper boat is the boat that fetches people. The tide carries the paper boat out, and if the paper boat comes back on its own, it means it picked someone up. Once the person boards the boat and the lamp is lit, the boat brings him home." He said this rule had been passed down by the elders for hundreds of years. The paper boat has to be folded from tin foil, and while folding it you chant the person's name. Inside the boat's belly you place 1 grain of rice, as rations for the one coming back. The lamp has to stay lit until dawn. If the paper boat capsizes or sinks before dawn, it means the person has been taken away, and you're not allowed to fish it out. If you do, the person won't be able to leave.
I said, "Then what about that big paper boat I saw? Its lamp was so bright, it didn't seem like it was folded from tin foil." Old Zhou stubbed out his cigarette and said, "If you can see the lamp, it means the person has reached the doorstep of his home. We Wenzhou people have a saying, lamp shines, boat arrives. The families of men who went out to sea light a lamp for them every year, waiting. Once the lamp shines, he knows where home is, and he starts walking back." He paused, then said, "But there are also those who can't come back. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they can't. There's a stretch of water outside the mouth of the O River that the old folks call the water of no return. Once a boat enters that water, it can't get out. Once a person falls into that water, he can't come up. Back then, a Ming's boat sank right at the edge of the water of no return." I said, "Then if a Ming can't come back, why did a Chui say one came back?" Old Zhou looked at me. "A Chui isn't waiting only for a Ming. Her family's boat, a Ming's boat, had 7 men on it. 5 came back, and 2 still haven't. A Ming was a deckhand, and the other was an engineer named a Gui. What a Chui meant was that one got fetched back. As for whether it was a Ming or a Gui, even she can't say for sure. Either way, they're both her family's men. Fetching back one is one." I said, "Then how does she know one was fetched back?" Old Zhou didn't answer. After a while, he said, "When the paper boat sinks, it means it fetched someone. The boat takes the person aboard, and then it sinks. If the boat doesn't sink, the person doesn't leave. That big paper boat you saw, sinking in the middle of the river, it means it took someone away." After saying this, he refused to say anything more.
Old Zhou also told me one more thing. In 1976, during a typhoon, 2 boats outside the mouth of the O River never came back. One family had an old woman who burned paper offerings by the river every year on the 15th day of the 7th month. On the 3rd year of doing this, someone saw a figure standing in the fog, wearing a blue cloth shirt, face indistinct, standing facing the direction of her house all night, and only fading away near dawn. The old woman said it was her son. He'd come back, taken a look at home, and left again. Old Zhou said, "Came back, took a look, and left again. That kind of person is one who can't come back. Someone who can come back won't even reach the doorstep of his home. The lamp is shining, and he just walks right in." That winter, the demolition for Shuomen Street reached our alley. Old Zhou's old house was also in the demolition zone. He said he wasn't moving, he was going to move to his daughter's place across the river. A month before he moved, 3 nights in a row, in the dead of night, I heard footsteps outside my back door. They weren't human footsteps, they were wet. Slap, slap, like someone walking barefoot on wet ground, each step making a sound, coming from the direction of the river, stopping at my back door. The first 2 nights I didn't dare open the door. On the second night, I pressed my eye to the crack in the door and looked out. The blue stone slabs outside the threshold were glistening, as if water had been splashed. The water was spreading toward the door, reached the threshold, stopped, then receded 2 steps, then came forward again, like something was pacing back and forth outside the threshold. On the third night, I gathered my courage and pulled the door open a crack. There was no one outside. But on the blue stone slabs at the door, there was a trail of wet prints, wet all the way from the river to my doorway, and at the threshold, it stopped. The wet marks were individual footprints, very small, like a woman's feet, or a child's. The toe prints were clear, and 1 drop of water still hung on the stone slab, glistening. The next day I told old Zhou. He was packing up his things. When he heard this, he paused mid-motion. He said, "It came looking for you?" I said I didn't know, it just stopped at my door. Old Zhou said, "The night you moved in, I gave you a key. Remember? That key was my great-grandmother's. She said there was an old rule on Shuomen Street, whenever a stranger came to a house, you let the great-grandmother's key get acquainted with the door first. Once it recognized you, you were family, and nothing would happen." Only then did I remember, there was indeed a key made of copper, very old, hanging behind the door all along. I went home and found the key. The copper key was covered in green rust. On the handle was carved a character, hard to make out, looked like Zhou. Old Zhou said, "My great-grandmother passed away in the 30th year of the Republic, 1941. Before she died, she gave the key to my mother and said, 'As long as the key hangs behind the door, this house has someone watching over it. Things that come up from the river, if they recognize this key, they won't come in.'"
Old Zhou said, "Hang it back behind the door and don't touch it. If the wet footprints come again, you tell it, this house has someone."
I then asked old Zhou how his great-grandmother had come by that key. Old Zhou said that when his great-grandmother was young, she ran a ferry across the river. One foggy year, as it was getting dark, she had gathered up her boat and was about to go home when a man appeared on the bank, wearing wet clothes, and asked to cross the river. Great-grandmother said, "The fog is too thick, come over tomorrow." The man said, "I can't wait, there's an emergency at home." Great-grandmother ferried him across. When they reached the other shore, the man got off the boat, pulled a copper key from his chest, and handed it to her, saying, "Keep this for me, I'll come to get it another day." Then he turned and walked away, into the fog, and vanished. Great-grandmother stood at the bow holding the key for a long time, puzzled. Why would a man crossing the river carry a key with him? After that, she asked everyone she met if they had lost a key. She asked for decades, and no one claimed it. So she hung the key behind the door and said, "If he comes for it one day, I'll give it to him." She waited her whole life, but the man never came again. Old Zhou said, when his great-grandmother passed, the key was still hanging behind the door. My mother said, just before she closed her eyes, great-grandmother said one thing, "If he comes for the key, tell him I waited until the river ran dry." After that night, I never heard the sound of wet footprints again. But that key, I forgot to take it with me when I moved. I've thought about it ever since, and I can't shake the feeling that I owe old Zhou something.
In early spring of 2005, fog rose over the Jiangxin River and didn't lift for 3 straight days. On the 4th night, I couldn't sleep, so I walked down to the riverbank alone. The Jiangxin in the fog was so quiet it was frightening. The tower lights on Jiangxin Islet hung in the air like 2 eyes, flickering on and off. I stood by the river for a while and saw the ferry still tied up at the dock. The boatman was smoking at the bow, the tip of his cigarette glowing red with each drag. I asked him if he still made crossings at night. He said he did, it's just that few people went to the island after dark. I said, I'll go. When the boat reached the island, I stepped ashore. Few people came to the island at night. It was pitch black, with only the East Tower and West Tower showing lights. Those were navigation beacons installed by the Cultural Relics Department, turning on automatically at night. I walked around the island and past Jiangxin Temple. The gate was shut, and the plaque reading Clear Radiance. Above the door was blurry in the fog. I passed Howran Tower too. It was locked as well. When I got to the foot of the West Tower, I stopped. The West Tower is a Song Dynasty pagoda, built of brick, with a slender body and iron bells hanging from the eaves. The wind was light, yet the bells didn't ring. I looked up at the tower for a long time, and suddenly felt that someone was on top of it. Not that I could see anyone. It was just a feeling. Someone was standing on the tower roof, looking down at me.
I stepped back 2 paces. Right then, the tower bells rang. Not from the wind, 1, 2, 3 peals, like someone had plucked them by hand. The sound was crisp and carried especially far through the fog. After the 3rd peal, a cough came from the top of the tower. Very soft, but perfectly clear, an old man's cough.
I turned and headed straight for the riverbank. When I reached the ferry, the boatman was still smoking at the bow. I boarded, and he asked me, "See something?" I said someone coughed up on the tower. The boatman laughed. "That's Grandpa Zheng, the tower keeper. He's lived up there for 40 years. He doesn't come down, and if you go up, he won't like it. The cough you heard, that's him telling you the tower's got a keeper. Don't you get any ideas?" I said, "I never heard there was a tower keeper on the island." The boatman flicked his cigarette butt into the river. "Grandpa Zheng doesn't want people to know. He says the fewer people who know about the tower, the sturdier it stands. Besides, these days everyone watches the lights, not the man. Nobody remembers the keeper, so nobody remembers what's buried beneath the tower either."
I asked him what was buried beneath the tower. The boatman pushed the boat away from shore and said, "That, I wouldn't know. Grandpa Zhang knows, but he won't say. 3 generations of the Zhang family have kept this tower, his great-grandfather kept it, his father kept it, he keeps it." He did say one thing, though, the tide of the Ojiang flows out to the sea, but some things under the Ojiang move toward the shore.
When the boat reached the other side, I got off. I looked back. Jiangxin Island was soaked in fog, only the lights on the 2 towers still burning. The boatman lit another cigarette on his boat and called out to me, "Young man, remember this. In the fog, the lights that shine ain't the towers, they're boats heading home." I asked him, "How do you know?" The boatman said, "I've been ferrying for 40 years. I've seen plenty of lights in the fog. Tower lights stay still. Boat lights move. Lights that move, those are people going home." He said, "As many lights as there are on the Ojiang, that's how many people never came back. When the lights are many, even the fog can't block them out." I looked back again. Sure enough, in the fog there were 2 lights, small and glowing, drifting along the river toward Shuomen, moving slowly, as if afraid of waking something. In 2011, I passed through Wenzhou on a business trip and got off at Jiangxin Island dock. The island had changed completely. They built a visitor center, installed a light show, and at night the twin pagodas were bathed in colored light, one red, one green, visible from far away. The night boats on the river all looked at the lights now, not the pagodas. Jiangxin Temple was still there, and the door couplet was still there, Wang Shizhong's title couplet. Read quickly, it sounded just like chanting sutras. I stood at the temple gate for a while, bought a ticket, and went on to the island.
I walked to the foot of the West Pagoda. The pagoda had been restored, and the iron bells were still there, tied up with red cloth strips so they couldn't ring. I asked the woman selling water nearby whether Grandpa Zheng was still around. She said, "Grandpa Zheng? He passed away the year before last, over 90. Before he died, he had someone tie the pagoda bells up with red cloth, saying, "When the bells ring, it means a boat is coming into port." No need for that now, the boats all look at the lights, not the bells. The bells have rested, and so has he. I asked who looks after the pagoda now. She said, no one. Everyone just looks at the lights and the surveillance cameras. When Grandpa Zhang left, the Jing family's guardianship of the pagoda ended with his generation. I stood at the foot of the pagoda for a while. Suddenly I thought of old Zhou. Before I was transferred out of Wenzhou that year, old Zhou had given me all the keys to his old house, saying, "The house is going to be demolished. Keep the keys, as something to remember it by. In the future, if you're somewhere far away and you hear the sound of the O River's tide, it means Wenzhou is calling you."
I asked the water vendor what Shuomen Street looked like now. She said it had been torn down in the demolition, all the old houses were gone, and all that was left was a stretch of old dock by the river, preserved as a cultural relic, fenced off so people couldn't go down to it. I asked where the old residents of Shuomen Street had moved. She said, scattered here and there, all over the place. That Achui at the end of the street, her son had bought an apartment in Obey and taken her to live with him. The day she moved, the neighbors all came to see her off. She didn't bring anything with her, just a stack of tin foil paper. Someone asked her what she needed that for, and she said, "Ghost Festival is coming, I'll need it." I said, "Didn't they bring her husband back already?" The woman looked at me and said, "Who was brought back, who knows? Paper boats sink in the river every year, and every year someone comes back. Whether the one who came back was a Ming or a Gue, or someone else's family member, nobody can say for sure. Anyway, every year people set out to sea on the O River, and every year some don't come back. Lights on, boat arrives, lights off, the boat goes to some other family." I asked again about that Achui at the end of the street. The woman thought for a moment. "You mean the one who set out paper boats every year?" She moved away, moved in with her son. But every year at Ghost Festival she still comes back and sets a paper boat on the water. The boat sinks as soon as it's launched, every year without fail. Her son says that's how she brings her husband home.
I left the island, took a cab to Shuomen. Sure enough, the old dock was enclosed by railings. Inside the railings, a stretch of blue stone dock jutted out into the river, the stones covered in moss, the tide licking up the steps one by one. I gripped the railing and watched for a while. That afternoon, the O River was going out, the water receding inch by inch. When it had receded to its lowest point, I saw on the stone at the far end of the dock a trail of wet prints, damp, fresh, footprint after footprint, walking up out of the water, coming ashore, reaching the railing, and stopping. The prints were very small, like a woman's feet, or a child's. It hadn't rained that day, and there was no one by the river. I stood there for a long time. Then I remembered, Achui's paper boat that year had sunk toward the middle of the river. But those footprints, they were walking from the river up onto the shore. People in Wenzhou have a saying, "Lights on, boat arrives." But no one ever said, when the boat arrives, who it is that steps off. The story's over. What do you think? If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. New urban legend every day.